Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Michigan Engineering DEI lecture. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here. These lectures are an important element of our People First Engineering focus, where we are committed to engaging our entire community, learning and growing together. My name is Sara Pozzi. I'm a professor of nuclear engineering and radiological sciences and the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Michigan Engineering. It's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker for our lecture. Dr. James Hawley is an assistant professor of mechanical engineering and a core faculty member within the engineering education research program here at the University of Michigan. He earned a bachelor's degree from Tuskegee University and a master's degree from Michigan State University, both in mechanical engineering. He earned his doctorate in engineering education from Purdue University. His scholarship focuses on the ways disciplinary knowledge, such as mechanical engineering, reinforces racialized power, the role of culture and cognition in teaching and learning, and preparing pre-college engineering educators to identify and counteract racial inequities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Hawley. James?
Hello. Greetings all. Oops, let me share my screen. I always forget that. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure and honor to have folks' attention, for folks to make time and space to hear you out. I will say, Sarah, one correction, it's James Hawley Jr. Please say the junior. Appreciate that. But very honored and appreciate this opportunity. I'll start off, well, let me get here. So be pretty plain and straightforward today. Three things I'll address. One, this idea of DEI and claiming it's a fallacy. I actually got a term from a friend of mine, Fantasy Nicole, who you'll hear from later today. But it's a misnomer. I think not necessarily as what it was, when you think of the letters individually and the meanings of those words, but how it's used, how it functions. I'll talk more about that. Secondly, I'll talk about 3 C's of engineering. If you saw the abstract, I'm talking about content, culture, and what I call consequences of engineering. And thirdly, this idea of do or die. And that is framing this idea that equity, justice, humanity of Black folks is past due. So I'm coming from the standpoint of what is due Black people, particularly those who study engineering, but also more broadly as a society, as engineering influences us all, right? Or, die in the sense of, really trying to move towards ideals of, liberty, democracy, like those things I think are largely dead already, right? Barely alive. But if we continue to move down this way of operating, then it will certainly die. Life as we know it, or have known it. I want to start off or move forward with a poem by a friend of mine to set the mood, set the vibe. And in this poem, I ask you all to engage in the chat with things that resonate with you as you listen to these words.
How are you going to tell anybody how it feels to be in love if they've never been in love? And what about your freedom? How do you convince a generation to fight for a freedom they've never seen? A new way of seeing the skin they woke up in, that skin more melanated than the truth they've been fed. Where is the proof? Their eyes will ask you, where is the proof? Where are our examples, our warriors, to exist in the shadows of your home country's education and need the light of day in ways you cannot see? Our babies need proof. And I am that proof. We are that proof. The Nina Simone reflecting liberators, the Ray Landis equity makers, the Julian Earls, the Marion Blaylocks, the proof of lives enriched by sticking with the truth that it cannot stay like this. Our kids need real opportunities tailored to fit the homes they grew up in. They need the Derek Scotts, the Virginia Booths with comfortable dialects that sound like proof that your native tongue ain't ghetto everywhere, and that your made-up songs have value in the air, proof that a culture is worth its weight in communities striving for change, proof that we deserve a system that doesn't make a game and statistic out of our survival, proof that access is granted to more than my test scores. They need to be sure they can give back to their communities, because what's the fun in surviving on your own and thriving with no home, just houses made of money made and paid outside of your own communities? Their eyes will beg you for proof and accept nothing less than a guarantee that they can do something to grow the roots of their family's tree. We are that proof. The seeds of communities built to love where they came from, unashamed of the names they gave us, because they'll always have to call us something. Minority, underrepresented, underserved, underexposed. I prefer underimpressed. Neglected with the rest of the children of the hardworking nation builders. No more patience building. It's time to put the truth in the air and on the news and into the curriculum, because my kids ain't dumb. Culturally wealthy in ways our systems call unhealthy. They stealthy with the way they oppress my kind. And they ain't never been colorblind. Income bias and maybe tax averse, but never unaware of the place they try to put us. Maybe they need proof, just like my babies. They need a mini McGee that they can still see. We are that proof. Proof that we are not a foreign policy or option or interest group. Proof that we are citizens too, and too tired to still be neglected, too inspired to stay where you left us, too powerful to stay disconnected. The rest is history in the making. Freedom for the taking. How are you going to tell anybody how it feels to be in love if they've never been in love? And what about your freedom? Show them the proof.
So again, I ask you to engage in the chat. I see some comments. What things resonate with you? What things are sticking with you? What things are you thinking about? A couple of things. I mean, there's plenty in this poem to think about for me that resonates with me. But first, I think the backdrop of Nina Simone's song, Young, Gifted, and Black, and just how that was, and I would argue still is, a radical statement to say that Black folks are gifted, right? And not in the terms of the context of advanced education or people who have special talents, but rather as normal human beings, that they have talents and purposes, that we have talents and purposes, right? And throughout the poem, Chanel gets at the point that it's not us who is lacking or deficient, but rather the structures and power structures of our society that is trying to keep us contained and suppressed, right? And so that's the point where I get into this conversation. But another thing I particularly appreciate is how Chanel calls out who I call gate holders. So oftentimes people talk about gatekeepers, right? The folks who are keeping other folks out. Whatever the context may be is exclusive. There are barriers set up that maintain that exclusivity. And when Chanel talked about Julian Earls, Marion Blaylock, Virginia Booth Womack, specifically she named Derek Scott, who is a gentleman that I didn't even know. I've been here, this is my second year, but I heard his name a lot when I told folks I was coming here. And so he has a strong legacy of supporting students here at the University of Michigan. And I call these folks gate holders because if you can imagine like castle gates that come down, these are the folks where while the institution and the structure is trying to keep folks out, they're literally holding the gate open. The bottom of the gate, again, those dungeons, castle gates are very sharp so that folks can be punctured if they stay under. And I view these folks, if you can go there with your imagination, I view these folks as their hands, arms, whatever they have being punctured to hold open the gate so the excluded, in this case, speaking about Black folks, can get in, can get access. And the true gate holders, they don't only hold open the gate, but they come and they give you crumbs off the king's table. They make sure you're good, right? They make sure you get blankets, even as you are marginalized within the kingdom, right? And so I'm honored to be here and be able to speak to you all, but I think is that those folks who really can take a lot of lessons from, and it's folks who I've learned from who have been in those positions. And so I have made mainly two claims on why I view DEI as a fallacy. And so we'll go through those. The first is DEI, I argue, is a social construction designed to preserve the white power structure or hierarchy without redress, right? So I'll go through a book that kind of explains how this plays out at the University of Michigan, or has played out. But I think when we look at the function of DEI, not individuals who have DEI positions, diversity, equity, inclusion positions, not folks who engage in these activities, but the function of what diversity, equity, inclusion does, it really allows this reality where institutions can both claim to support change, difference, equitable measures, and yet never deal with or reckon with the fact, the policies, the procedures, the practices, the people who have why the DEI is needed, right? The history of exclusion and inequity. And so it allows this duality to exist, right? And it's very tiring for those of us who want to see change. The other part of that is, and I'm kind of losing my thought. So it allows a duality. Oh, DEI was not designed to address oppression, right? So that's the other thing. The DEI, when we talk about diversity and just being different, many folks have reformed the definitions or revised or tried to find ways to articulate the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what you see, even in those re-articulations, they don't address this larger structure and social system of oppression. They are meant to say, a lot of people talk about, well, we just need a seat at the table. Diverse people need seats at the table. But what good is it if different people are coming to the same table that they have been excluded from? It may appear to be progress, but those underlying structures that we'll get to persist and reproduce new forms of harm. The second one is this idea is that DEI appropriates the previously excluded. So talking about Black people here, it appropriates them and consequently suppresses the growth of alternative spaces. This is a generic way of what I'm specifically speaking to is places like historically Black colleges and universities, of which I am a product, right? Or I got my bachelor's degree at HBCUs. And so what happens is with DEI, when institutions are able to market themselves as being open and welcoming, and this actually goes beyond just race and racism, but in particular, I'm talking about anti-Black racism today. Instead of those students being drawn to places where they can exist and be viewed as humane, they are drawn to these types of institutions because of the marketing, the new initiatives, the strategic plans that appears that the institution is going to change, and yet nothing truly changes. So first claim, there's a book called Undermining Racial Justice by Matthew Johnson, came out 2 years ago. And in that book, I think he does a really good job of talking about the history of Michigan and the ways it's politically leveraged diversity. But he talks specifically about Black activism and the experiences of Black students. And so I want to dig into this quote. It says, the members of the Michigan community who are attracted to this new language talking about diversity focus exclusively on diversity's potential to improve race relations, ignoring the fact that Black students were using diversity language to justify programs that address their feelings of social alienation and to gain more power over the spaces they inhabit. So those are two different things, right? So part of the political function of diversity or DEI altogether is there's not a shared understanding necessarily of what they mean and what we're using it for. Is it to advance technological production? Is it to maintain, primacy of the national imperialistic primacy? Like what? And so because it's largely nebulous and ambiguous, it allows different people with even competing interests to leverage it. And what we see here is the University of Michigan being exclusive to Black people says, hey, let's bring in these folks so we can do something about the white prejudice that exists within our community. And so while the folks who are there are looking to bring other folks in, the folks who are being brought in are saying, hey, no, we're trying to use it we know we've been alienated. We know that we've been left on the margins. We need these other programs. So we're trying to use this language to get what we need to exist and be well. And everyone else is saying, no, come hang with us. It's okay, we'll be different, we'll change, we'll do things differently, right? So that's one. But the second part where the political aspect comes in is they were trying to leverage it to gain power over the spaces they inhabited. So it's one thing to be able to exist in the space. It's another thing to have your perspective, your way of viewing the world, your knowledge, your sense-making, meaning-making practices being valued, for you to have self-determination within that space, as opposed to you being appreciated as long as you go along and assimilate to the mainstream. Those are different realities. And so this is why I say DEI is largely socially constructed to be leveraged to retain the ideology of white supremacy. My second argument is use some statistics. Historically Black colleges and universities represent less than 3% of all colleges. There's approximately 105 HBCUs, and so that's what that number on the left is. Moving to the top right, that's 16%. Even though they represent less than 3% of all higher ed institutions, they produce about 16%, at least in 2018, they produced 16% of Black engineering degree earners. Okay, so let me say it again. HBCUs represent less than 3% of all colleges and institutions. But for Black students, they produce 16% of those who earn engineering degrees in particular, right? So not STEM, not business at large, but specifically engineering. And so that's an outsized contribution to society, right? And so this idea of DEI, where folks are like, what's wrong with Black students, or how can we get more Black students? We have institutions who have long been not just shepherding Black students, but producing successful Black graduates. And they're not just degree owners at the bachelor graduate level, right? Because you could argue, well, anybody can get a degree. What does that mean? But the 30% number says HBCUs are responsible for 30% of Black doctoral engineering and science students. So these students are not only graduating, these students are not only going to the workforce, but these students are also pursuing graduate study at institutions like the University of Michigan. As we heard in my background, I went to Michigan State afterwards, and even Purdue University. So this idea that they're not good enough, they're not capable, it holds no weight when we look at actual data and statistics. So what is the role of DEI? What purpose is it really serving? And again, I argue that it is to preserve the white power structure, but also preventing these type of institutions from being better able to serve students in a broader white power structure. And I'll get back to that sense of belonging and things like that in a little bit. So moving on to the 3 C's of engineering. First, we look at engineering content. Many folks are aware that whether you've gone through an undergraduate engineering program or not, many folks are pretty aware that the curriculum of engineering at the undergraduate level and really graduate too, is largely based on mathematics. Some folks will argue science, and I would say to a certain extent, but largely it's mathematics. And that was from the beginning of engineering education formation in the United States. So in 1807 was the first creation of a formal engineering education program, and that was at West Point. It was a military academy, right? I'll let you all recall and think about where most of the Black folks in the nation were during 1807. But while that was going on, engineering education programs were created. And so there's a paper by Dr. Erin Seck, which at the end of my presentation, I have references for all the different resources I'm relying on, but she has a paper that talks about how engineers tend to misframe issues of social justice. One point that she makes, and I should also say Dr. Seck is a sociologist. He's here at University of Michigan in the Department of Sociology, and also has a joint appointment with mechanical engineering. So you can access her. She's doing great work around here. But she talks about this ideology, this logical positivism, the belief that science and engineering work can be separated from messy social concerns as long as proper scientific and engineering methods of inquiry and design are followed. Sorry, it's a typo there. And so instead of critiquing explicitly the over-reliance on mathematics, which has already been done, a lot of folks get at that, I want to focus here on this idea of logical positivism, because that is the root of where the emphasis on science and mathematics comes. Dr. Seck also talks about these ideologies of depoliticization, separating social and technical knowledge, and not just separating them, but seeing social knowledge as inferior to technical knowledge and technical training. And then she talks about meritocracy, the belief that we live in a just system. So all these things work together to justify the absence of Black people in engineering, or the minimal or the low presence, right? And so part of the issue is we need to expand the content of the curriculum, and not just in general. And that's not just bringing social problems or social issues to discuss, but there's a way of thinking about the world that engineers are socialized into. And it doesn't explicitly say Black people can't be engineers. It doesn't explicitly say that Black people's issues don't matter. But what it does say is we're here to do science and engineering, and true engineering work is not related to these social issues, even though there are social implications. That's a deeply embedded problem that prevents us from not only getting at the issues of Black people, but more broadly moving to a context where engineers can address the broader issues that they have actually caused, right? And so moving on to another, well-known Michigan scholar, Dean Alec Gallimore, he's recently been talking about equities in engineering, and now that's expanded to people first engineering. Last year, I believe it was, he did a Q&A, question and answer session. I think it's a really good, and I have my copy here highlighted. I think it's a really good discussion that he provides. But one of the things he says that engineering training is incomplete without incorporating fields such as ethics, social science, the humanities, history, and matters associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so to the faculty online and the talk, the first thing I would suggest to argue and encourage is we need to figure out how not just the electives or some courses, right? Because I offer a course called Mechanical Engineering and Social Justice, ME 499, will be offered in the winter. And in that course, I focus a lot on the social science and history of engineering, right? That's how I can speak to the formations of the first engineering program. The first engineering program as a Black institution was in 1911, really technically 1907, I'm sorry. It's a 2-year engineering program at Howard University, which expanded to a 4-year program in 1911, right? And so in between that time, you had 2 land grant or Moral Land Grant Acts, and those gave money to expand specifically participation in studying engineering. But the first one, I think in 1862, only focused on white institutions and access to white people. And then in 1890, that was expanded to provide money for Black institutions or alternative programs. And so all these things have social implications, and it's important to look at the history of where we came from to understand how did these ideologies of positivism and so on and so forth, which contribute to how we make sense of the world, how are they so deeply embedded and limited in our engineering education process? Because prior to 1807, the first engineering education program, engineering was happening. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but engineering has always existed into ancient countries and kingdoms of ancient history. But when it became formalized in American and United States institutions, there was a certain framing that took place. And so we need to understand where that came from and why it was framed in that way to be able to reconstruct and build new ways of learning. But in particular, Dr. Seck talks about the one-off courses, right? And so I'm currently involved with a project called the DEI Case Study Initiative. And so in that project, we build or develop modules that can be inserted into engineering courses. And we try to do more than that, but it's a start, right? And so one of the things that Dr. Seck says is like, yes, we can make connections to the social science and humanities in a course or in a module, but that alone is insufficient because we need to deconstruct these ideologies. And so that's why on this slide, I put these 2 commentaries together, and I encourage you to go check out the entire work or articles from both of these. Moving then into culture, because content is mainly around in the classroom and the explicit interactions between professors and students, but there's a broader culture that goes along as you progress through classes, as you do extracurricular activities, as you interact with administrators. And so typically when we talk about culture, we look at this tree image. Typically when folks talk about culture, they're looking at surface culture, things like songs associated with different racial groups, hairstyles, music, and food. Right? And this graphic displays that there are different levels, and particularly deep culture is where I want to get at. And so what does it look like for engineering? At a high level, we can see that engineering is analytical, a lot of analytical thinking. We can say it's very masculine due to the demographics of who's there. It requires a lot of hard work. We can get to this idea of hard work. But as I said earlier, it also focuses on a lot of math. So for a lot of folks, this is what engineering is. It's white, meaning there are a lot of white people within engineering. And again, we need history to understand why that is and how that shapes what it means to do engineering. And then efficiency, right? And so there are many other aspects, things that we can see easily identify. If we dig a little bit deeper, we see that, as I said, engineering is exclusive, but in particular competitive. So it's not only that white people exist or masculine or men are there or that it's math, but there's also, you have to look at your peer in a different way. A lot of that is initiated through things like curve grading, right? Where it's not based on my individual competence, but it's about how I do in relation to someone else. A lot of that is due to many other things as well. Militarism, as I stated, engineering was born out of a military academy, or at least it was institutionalized, I should say. Militarism, civil engineering was the first engineering discipline, and the goal was to use technology to advance imperialistic ambitions, as well as building up society, highways, bridges, and things like that. And so as that became less of a need, then it began to expand into other interests, and that's where we get the moral acts and things like that. Ideas of objectivity, and there's a lot of working in teams. One of the things, again, when we get to shallow culture and go a little bit deeper, we see that it's not just about that people are put together. We need to understand, how do we work well in teams? What motivations and interests and perspectives influence the way that people work together? So at the root of the culture of engineering, we see this idea of hardness and depoliticization. There was a paper where some scholars studied the culture of engineering. This is one of the things that they found. The theme of hardness seemed to permeate the conversations of faculty and students, conveying worth and status with a devaluing of content or subject areas which were seen as easier to solve. So as you see when I go through, these things connect back to prior things. So going back to the content, one of the reasons why engineering does not engage with the social sciences, humanities, and history, because those are seen as soft sciences. The knowledge and even the skills, communication skills, speaking, working together, are seen as soft skills, right? And so in engineering, where hardness is esteemed, there's a belief that because something is more difficult, making things difficult intentionally, even if it's unnecessary, those who can make it and survive are the ones who deserve to be here. When we look at mathematics and how abstract mathematics can get, the goal is not about, is this mathematics actually relevant for engineering work? It's more so those who can do it are the ones who belong here. Another paper talked about, it was recognized that academic survival and success would be very difficult for any student who was marginalized or a loner. So going back to the quote around Black students who were trying to leverage diversity to get programs to be included and to gain more power in the spaces that they inhabit, they understood that when they were being socially isolated and alienated, they were also, that influenced their academic success, right? So to get in the institution, you know, after having already overcome racist qualifiers like the SAT, you know, standardized test scores and things like that, and other measures of who's credentialed. After doing all of that, once they get into the institution, they're marginalized and put on the side. And so being a loner, when you have to work in teams and no one wants to work with you, or when you have to work in teams and people don't value your intellectual contribution, they realize that the social isolation led to an academic isolation and disconnect, right? And so this is reinforced by this idea, by these scholars. They're saying that academic survival is hard because, one, we have this idea of individualism, but reality of engineering is you need to know somebody. You have to know resources. You know, whether, you know, if we're honest, students passing down resources across generations, so past tests. And that doesn't mean that people are cheating. Sometimes it's just to get a sense of what type of questions could be asked. Because if anybody had shared experience like I have, many nights and many days and many exams, I study, and I'll go in the exam and I'm just like, is this the right class? Like, we did not cover this in these prior, last few weeks. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience. And so if you're working only by yourself, those experiences add up and you feel like I just don't belong here. Meanwhile, there's a study group of 5 to 10 students meeting somewhere else, and they're leveraging each other's intellect and experience and familiarity and intergenerationally. Oh, my uncle was an engineer. My aunt went here some years ago and they told me X, Y, and Z. Like, that stuff matters in the classroom and we don't discuss it, even though it's very prevalent. And the last aspect I'll talk about is consequences. And what I mean by consequences is when people engage in engineering work, what happens? So this is both in industry and companies, when people are working in teams and working with one another, because that's a social aspect of engineering, where these false neutralities and false objectivity shows up. but also when it comes to actually designing and creating and producing and recreating out in the world. And so just looking at some of the consequences that have had anti-Black effects, starting with in 1619, slavery chains and ships, right? The chains and ships that were used to enslave African folks, West African at that time. In other presentations, I've shown a graphic where the chains around the captured African's neck were in a way where you link one person to the next, right? And so chains were not naturally developed in that way. Somebody forged those, right? And as this enterprise began to expand, particularly as someone who's in mechanical engineering, I look at those things as mechanical devices that were innovatively extended to capture and enslave large swaths of people. Same thing with the ships that people were, brought across the water. Ships were created for transport, for products, right? But then it shifted to human cargo. And we are bigger than spices or clothing and things like that. And so the ships began to get expanded and designed in a way to maximize the number of bodies that can be transitioned. Workforce development, one of my modules or some of the work I talk about is even as Black folks were educated, right? Because although there was some chattel slavery in the North, it was at a much less extent than what it was down South. But it doesn't mean that folks who were viewed as free, Black folks viewed as free, were treated equally. And so even if you could get educated, one, you couldn't get educated at white institutions, but those who went to places like Canada, like Elijah McCoy, and were educated and then went off to Scotland to learn engineering through an apprenticeship, when he came back to the United States, he could not get work. And so workplace discrimination set us back and held us back for many years. But even now, as we are allowed and admitted to work at certain companies, the question is, are we treated as equal contributors? Right. Moving along after that, actually another one example I talk about is Henry Ford, right? So many folks celebrate Henry Ford for allowing Black folks to work at equal wages as white people, during his era. But what is not often discussed is the Black employees had the most dangerous jobs, right? And so it's not saying that nobody should do those dangerous jobs. It just needs to be a shared risk, right? If I got to do it, somebody else should be able to do it too, not just all the Black folks. The U.S. highway system has rose to prominence given the recent discourse around interstate highways that came out of the Biden administration and giving funds to reconstruct or do things with these highways. So in Detroit, right, Chrysler Freeway raised the Black Bottom, which was a thriving Black community, and then Paradise Valley, which was the economic district to that Black community, were raised, meaning destroyed, for the construction of the Walter P. Chrysler Freeway in 1965, I believe. But this wasn't just a Detroit phenomenon, right? So there's a scholar, Dr. Reagan Patterson, she's at UCLA, just across the nation in all these Black communities, how they were seen as, dispendable, right? We want to connect the suburbs to the urban center where most of white folks are working. So let's just create this pathway through Black communities, and with no recompense, no reconfiguration or anything like that. And you see now there are projects where people are trying to, like in Detroit, they're going to tear down the Chrysler Freeway. But the question is, what is truly just to be reconstructed, or what should be done after that? And then lastly, engineering work has contributed largely to environmental toxicity. And so I need to move a little bit faster, but a lot of Black communities and other non-white communities are where some of the toxic productions and factories are located. And so there's many consequences for our health and development, but also our access to quality living, quality of life. And that's where that humane piece comes in when I'm talking about Blackness being humane. And so what do we do? So using a title from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, first is politicizing engineering. When I say repoliticize, because engineering is already politicized. Again, Dr. Sheck does a great job of unpacking the political aspects of engineering, but we need to be more explicit in the curriculum. Again, speaking to faculty, right? It shouldn't be just the electives or just the design courses that talk about the social implications and the political implications of engineering work. We as a collective, if we need to truly achieve racial equity, need to explore how do what's the relevance of statics? What's the relevance of controls, right? Robotics and things like where are the political aspects that are already there that we're just neglecting, that are omitted? And how can we construct our courses to be responsive to that? Students, I think, may even need some self-education to explore. There's a discipline called sociology and technological studies, social STS, I know is the shorthand, but they explicitly look at the role of technology in society. And so we need to normalize the connection between looking at society and its role in technology and engineering advancement. I specifically say that race consciousness is important because just talking politically does not mean that we're getting a better understanding of how the society, which was formed, literally forged and developed. So many governmental policies and procedures were based on anti-Black racism. And so we need to better understand that to be able to redirect, right? And even deal with the harm of that past. And so I talked about reconstructing education, but beyond the classroom, we need to look at those, again, what are those gates that prevent Black folks in particular from getting here or even being successful? Because if we look at other institutions, i.e. HBCUs, they're not only accepting students, but they're doing well to elevate and help them prosper, to discover and advance the gifts that they have. Whereas here, the large institutions, as I say, particularly large white institutions, what I call historically white institutions, things like, as I said earlier, the SAT and ACT, which has been shown historically to be racially biased. But even as a faculty member, things like, because it is one thing to go through the educational experience, but to be able to teach as a faculty member and sustain, we have things like the SET, Students' Evaluations of Teaching, which have also been shown to be racially and gender biased and other things. So we need to eradicate these measures and evaluators, when I call qualifiers, have already been shown to be racially problematic, right? And rethink. I know it's efficient. It's an engineering goal. It's efficient to keep doing them, and they serve certain purposes, but they're also serving to retain the white power structure. And then when it comes to research-informed methods of instruction, things like flipped classroom, things like having more discussions, those have caught on and have shifted a little bit of how engineers are taught, but we need to do much more. And then the third part I talk about is reimagining the future. Futurity is anything concerning the future, and that's where we need to engage our imagination. A lot of folks ask me, what do we do? What next? Or how do we this? And a lot of times those questions are only focused on responding to the problems that currently exist. And while we can do some progression and we can improve a little bit to truly be racially equitable, and particularly as it relates to Black folks and the history of racism in the country, we need new structures entirely. I'm not necessarily an advocate of, burn the university down. That's why I'm here. But I think we need to deal with the tension of what does it mean to recreate and reconstruct. Recognize that there are some limitations if you keep the structure, right? So a lot, not just some things need to change, but much of it needs to change to get to, presumed and promoted outcomes of racial difference, right? Not looking purely from a statistical standpoint. And Chanel's poem, she talked about our survival being viewed as statistics or some type of game. And so we need to look more qualitatively. What is really going on? Yes, you are here as a Black person, so you're a number, our percentages are going up, but what is your experience? Do you not only feel welcome, but do you feel as if you can exist as you want to? Do you feel as if you're controlling your academic trajectory as a staff member, faculty member, as well as a student? And so for the sake of questions, I have one more piece and I'll open it up. And so if you could place in the chat the lyrics. So the first, thank you. So the document has just been placed in the chat. You all can see the lyrics for this next poem, and you can follow along. I wasn't able to set it up that way, but this is a song a good friend of mine, Fantasy Nicole, created regarding the content of this presentation. Enjoy it, and after this, I'll open up for questions.
DEI must DIE, 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 DEI must DIE. It's just a fallacy. It camouflages truth with the guise of change. It might seem strange, but spreads like mange. No solution treatment, just a filthy band-aid and heavy burdens weigh. Here we go again with the subliminal lens, thinking DEI will change and save us from all of this sin. Sin against people, the system murders as a trend, but we're just covering patches, hoping that it will all blend. DEI should not be at the expense of oppressed, reliving trauma, fighting drama, rough side around our neck, but it should be the work of the people that it has addressed. Having privilege in the tower has always been your main flex, but I just wish that people would act on change, not just theorize and explain. I just wish that people would combat the system and listen to the oppressed wisdom. But DEI must DIE, 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 DEI must DIE. It's just a fallacy. It camouflages truth with the guise of change. Might seem strange, but spreads like mange. No solution treatment, just a filthy band-aid and heavy burdens weigh. DEI initiatives built on misinformed intentions, lacking the true definition of what it means to be diverse. It is the worst. Haven't heard of any preventions. My people still dealing with all of the perverse. How can something succeed without alignment to the mission? Organization so outdated the industry is tripping. Leadership stuck in their ways, can't see no other vision than DEI as a part instead of integral and winning. But DEI must DIE. I say it loud, hoping that you'll hear me now. Cause at the rate we're going, won't be nothing strong and sound. And the ivory tower will just come crumbling to the ground. But DEI must DIE, 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 DEI must DIE. It's just a fallacy.
All right, so again, thank you for your attention and your time. Happy to answer questions that have been shared either now or later. I know this was a lot, and so I'm happy to discuss further.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. James Holly Jr. Really appreciate you sharing this talk with us today. Very important to us all here at Michigan Engineering. So we have time for a few questions. And I want to start with one of the pre-submitted questions that had to do with the faculty perspective on how a faculty member could make their classroom a safe environment for underrepresented students. I know you mentioned several things during the talk, but I wonder if you wanted to elaborate on some steps, some concrete steps that faculty could take.
Yeah, so two things. One, just for the sake of trying to be short, one is bring them into the curriculum. And what I mean by that is historically, a lot of engineering history, traditionally, I should say, a lot of engineering history is based on the European influences that have contributed to the knowledge and knowledge that we have and reinforced. And so I think one of those ways is, making visible the contributions from non-white people. And not only just like non-white Americans, but again, engineering existed long before 1807 when it was formally institutionalized in the United States. And so bringing those contributions in, and not just for the sake of saying, hey, look what some Black people did, now back to but what can be learned from that, centering those experiences to see how we engineer in a different way. Secondarily, I think is instituting accountability for racial harm in the classroom. I think right now there are not many ways in which like the victim has to take responsibility when someone else is mistreating them. When they express that something has occurred, then the faculty member, if doing anything at all, will talk with them and ask them what can they do, as opposed to holding other students accountable, whether explicit or implicit exclusion that takes place in the classroom. And so that needs to be normalized, that accountability. Accountability doesn't necessarily mean punish, but what it means is people need to take notice that what you're doing is unacceptable, is wrong, And, you know, and if punishment is necessary or some type of consequence, then that will be instituted as well. But currently, a lot of anti-Black racism just goes unchecked.
Absolutely. And I point out the opportunities that we have with bystander intervention training, also here at the college level that could be helpful with that. There's a question about students struggling in the math sequence, and I know you had mentioned this during your talk. Could you comment a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's one of those when I think is tricky because is data is reinforced by data, right? If you look at the numbers, Black students are not performing as well. But the part of that question I thought was interesting is it says most of the struggle is in mathematics and not engineering, right? And so some of the things when I say like, you know, whatever, reconstructing education is thinking about what truly is success, because I would argue in engineering, there are some problems too that aren't just Black students, right? I spoke about curve grading. That's the example I beat up on a lot. But generally, the idea of curve grading means that if all students fail, right, if we trust that the assessment that was given to students was accurate and a legitimate assessment, typically it means if students don't do well, if all students score below 50 or the majority is only a couple outliers, we just reassess or reform the grades to create some distribution. But what I argue is what that means is that a lot of the students aren't actually understanding what's going on, right? It's not just that the lowest performers, there's a large culture of failure that gets reframed as passing through curve grading. And so I don't think it's only a problem in mathematics. I think it's also a real engineering problem in terms of academic competency and understanding and success. However, I also think there's just an over-reliance on mathematics as a gatekeeping form of getting into engineering, right? I think I have a lot of friends who work in engineering, and I'm not saying it's true for everybody, but at least of the ones that I talk to, many of them say much of the stuff they learn of mathematics, they don't necessarily need to know in their work. There are other ways, there's software, there are other things they can do, and there's more of this social, quote unquote, soft skills aspects of things that become more prevalent. The things that they actually weren't trained on become more prevalent in the work that they do. And so I think we need to reassess the curriculum to see, is it accurate? Is it aligned with the skills and knowledge that people know? Or is it still engaged in this archaic gatekeeping where it's about who can get through? It's more so a hazing process of folks getting through rather than actually preparing students to be effective in quality engineering.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. There's a good question that was put in the chat here live. The person says, I feel that DEI tries to promote some kind of optimistic and upwards thinking. And do you feel that instead focusing on oppression, which I feel is deficit thinking, is more important, and why exactly?
So the question says that focus on oppression is deficit thinking? Is that from the question?
Yeah, so sometimes with DEI, we have a spin that's more optimistic and upward.
All right, yeah. I just couldn't find that last part.
Focusing on the oppressive side, which can be
indeed, yeah, it is oppressive. I mean, if you look at history, it's quite daunting. Imagine if you actually lived through it, right? Like, I mean, I'm not here to spin anything positive or negative, right? I think it's just recognizing what is true. The things that's why I gave dates and things like that. I'm speaking about what has happened, what is known to be true. Now, if we want to call it bad or negative or deficit, again, that's another label we can use. But the reality is those things have informed the society that we have today. And if we want to move to a society that actually is more just, more happy, or truly beneficial and optimistic, then in my mind, we have to deal with that. We have to take notice and understand it to not recreate it, right? So one of the flaws of the social construction of DEI is always forward looking. But if you don't know where you came from, you're bound to repeat it, right? And I should credit whoever used that theorem or proverb or whatever the case may be. And it's not necessarily you're bound because there's some trickery, but it's just like the same ways of thinking will get us the same results. And so part of the deconstructing the past is to understand and be able to explicitly recognize the rationale, recognize how people were thinking, recognize the social and political decision-making procedures that led to this reality. And then, because the other piece is what I do in my work is build on Black intellectualism. Those are folks who are advocating for a different reality. And I think if we can then learn from those folks and we have a better way of a truer way forward out of this current existence. But I think regardless of what we feel about the mood, again, to have lived through it and to live with the residue of it is what much more traumatizing than the mood of the word, or to focus on it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. A question from a student. As a student at UM, the institution's talk about DEI feels politically motivated, while Black students are still being left behind. What tangible things can we change at UM Engineering to help more students feel included, accepted, and supported? In other words, what policy changes could be implemented?
Yeah, so I think that is at the heart of the claim number one, right? There's a political thing where the institution can pat itself on the back, continue to win awards while students are having, terrible experiences. And so one thing I think is moving from this idea of market research where students are kind of asked, are you having a good time? Are you not? To really looking at the scholarship around what contributes to students' negative experiences. What we often see is a lot of the work, a lot of the factors that contribute is interactions with peers and then interactions with faculty. And so that's where the accountability piece is. Policies need to be put in classrooms to where if you're working in a group and there's some conflict among students, there needs to be policies, race conscious policies to deal with that. One of those is there needs to be a mediator, right? If a student shouldn't have to go to the faculty member and then that issue only be contained within the class. There needs these, if we actually dealt with these things more often, we would have a better understanding of how prevalent the issues are that Black students are navigating and experiencing. And so I think that's one is all policies, just like we have, and not just these generic no discrimination. Racism doesn't necessarily work that way where it shows up explicitly, where someone is saying, I can't be with you. But when you're treated as a loner, right? So some of that I can't fully explain here, but there needs to be race conscious policies around student-student interaction and then student-faculty dynamics. Faculty, I'm not repeating anything new here, but faculty need to be held accountable and even incentivized to understand how their work is influenced by race. What's the implications of their work, but also interacting with students when you don't have high expectations, when you ask students, are you in the right classroom? When you are questioning students' contributions, when you don't call on students, when we use insensitive language. So I think part of, there's a lack of accountability. And I think that's the primary thing to start with is stopping the harm, mitigating the harm that's happening before we can get to creating spaces that Black students can actually thrive and insert their full selves. I just think it's just a fire hydrant of harm that Black students are trying to wade through. And then, so my first point would be around accountability policies.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question here. There's a question about the international landscape. So when we look at countries around the world and engineering education, is there a country that you feel is doing a much better job of educating engineers and that you could recommend as an example for the US?
No, my work focuses on the US, so I can't answer that.
Okay. Is there anything else that we didn't cover, James, that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, so I'll just say that I wouldn't say something that wasn't covered, but I just wanted to give a little more context that, like, one of the things a lot of times that I talk to people are like, yeah, give some tangible or something practical, right? And so I think what I would direct, so I have resources at the end of this, and so that stuff is already out there. I don't think that we have a lack of tangible actions that can be taken. I think, again, it's political. It's the will. Will institutions, will colleges like Michigan Engineering actually take up the actions? Will the strategic plans be revised in correlation? Are they informed by the research and scholarship that are out there? Right. So it's not that I don't want to give tangible or practical, what people view as tangible and practical things. I just think there's a lot of scholarship that there's some fundamental things that deal with the ideologies that Dr. Seck talks about. And I think also we have to get away from this idea of only looking at what's in front of us and broadening out. Engineering education research as a discipline is only about 16 years old. But if folks were able to begin to look at that work, we would get a better sense of the culture, that the experiences and perspectives that we have are not just individualized. So it's not just what I think or I feel, but it can be generalized to see what is going on at a higher level. What are some of the trends? What are some of the norms, and what may truly be aberrations that are happening in these dynamics? And then, I see Tercia active in the chat. So, checking out CRLT Engine, I strongly encourage, reaching out to, not reaching out to say, hey, help me do this, but looking at what's already there. They have a whole website, they have resources, they have workshops to educate people. I think the educational part, as I said earlier, the repoliticized education, and then the repoliticizing engineering and reconstruction and education, I think those are first. I don't see those as let's do something and then let's think about that at the same time. I think, no, I think we need to do some mental, intellectual work first. This is an institution of higher education. Right, this is a scholarly based institution. It's a research intensive institution. And so we need to center and follow that tradition of scholarship, centering scholarship, doing the hard work, thinking intellectually, so that our actions are informed by that and we're not repeating the same thing. I will also say that, what folks might have picked up on is with the title DEI, must die, or DIE, some folks, I was trying to be funny or just clickbait. But I truly believe, again, from a political functionality, that it's doing us more harm than good. And even though, as I spoke throughout the talk about DEI activities I'm actually involved in, I don't see that as my research and scholarship. But me, like many others, understand that if this is all that is given, this is what we have to work with. And we will subversively reform or leverage it however we need to. However, that also has a consequence of allowing it to exist. And so it's a real tension that even I sit in on how much to engage in these things and how much to, continue to do the work of staying outside and trying to move towards other things. And so, I don't see myself as a DEI advocate or worker. I respect a lot of those folks that were named earlier on, and the people who do that work. I think they're very intelligent people and underappreciated. However, that's not how I'm built. I'm more so, instead of a gate holder, I see myself as more like a traffic director, right? Like folks who are standing outside with the sign saying slow, go, I'm like, no, go there, right? Based on my experience and things like that, there are institutions in reality, like HBCUs, who have their own issues, largely due to the disparities in resources and funding that we can look to. But the question is Michigan Engineering ready to really do that real work?
Excellent. Well, on that note, I think we should thank you very much for this very thought-provoking lecture. We learned a lot. And our next DEI lecture will be November 10th at noon, featuring Dr. J. Sri Seth. Please look for your email for additional information about our November lecture, and we hope to see you there. We will send you a survey following the lecture, and we've actually dropped it in the chat. So please give us your feedback. We really look forward to it. Thanks again, and thanks for attending. Bye.